Hi and welcome everyone to today's Spotlight Lecture. So we're a bit later than we usually are. We're 6 o'clock in the evening here in the UK or thereabouts. And thank you for those joining across the world and different countries. We have Barcelona and all from the US. Cool. Yeah. But thank you those who are joining us here in the London office. It's great to see some faces new and old. And we are very excited to today have a lecture entitled 1,000 Miles Up the Hudson, 1889 to 90 US lecture tour of Amelia Edwards and Bradbury. And so I'm delighted to introduce in person Dr. Kathleen Sheppard, who is a professor in the History and Political Science Department at Missouri S&T in Rolla. She earned her MA in Egyptian Archaeology at UCL and her PhD in History of Science from the University of Oklahoma. She has authored several publications on the history of Egyptology, including her most recent volume, Women in the Valley of the Kings, The Untold Story of Women Egyptologists in the Gilded Age, which I have a copy here, which I can show in person, and I hope you can see it on Zoom. So in this book, Kathleen Sheppard explores the lives, loves, and legacies of 11 women associated with the Valley of the Kings, which is a quote I've taken from a review by Anna Garnett, which will be featured in the latest or upcoming Egyptian Archaeology magazine. So do read more about the book there, or please do go and buy it.
I'm always good.
And if you are wanting to know more about women in Egyptology, as you will see on the screen, we have an upcoming course by Kathleen Sheppard again, Women's Work in the History of Egyptology, starting next week. So that QR code will take you to that course, and we'll show this at the end, or you can find it on our website. So thank you all for joining us, whether in person or online. Thank you for bearing with us through any technical difficulties. And thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're going to get a little bit, maybe, of a sneak preview of some of the stuff that would be in the course. So if you like that, absolutely take it. I think it'll be really fun. So, as Kate Bradbury packed her and Amelia Edwards' trunks, she glanced over her long list of supplies. She was tasked by Amelia with making sure that the lantern slides were packed so they wouldn't break on a long ocean journey. She also had to make sure to pack plenty of warm clothing for both of them. It was mid-October 1889 in England, so the cool autumn temperatures had only recently set in, not like this past summer here, where it has not broken from the cool autumn temperatures. They would soon be traveling through the northern United States from November through March. They were warned of frigid air and almost constant snow on the ground, but Kate was used to some cold. She'd lived in Switzerland, been to the Alps of both Italy and France, and had traveled all over the UK with her father. Even though her uncles, William and Frederick, had lived in the US since before she was born, Kate had never been across the ocean. She also checked over the list of all of Amelia's salves and pills. There were a lot of bottles she had to keep straight. Her dear Amy had just recovered from typhoid, and she wasn't getting any younger. At 58, Amelia wasn't old, but she wasn't in the best of health. Kate also needed to remember to pack plenty of paper for writing. Like with most things on her list, she could buy some paper, she assumed, at a stationer in New York City, but she had promised her family she would write every day, and she planned to start right when they boarded the boat that would take them across the Atlantic, the HMS Etruria. She would also need to write to Emily Patterson, who was staying behind in England to manage the fund's daily business until Kate and Amelia returned in March. As she stowed more and more in their steamer trunks, she paused in wonder that everything would fit. I did that today when I was packing. Would the trunks be too heavy to drag from one hotel or house to the next? And as Kate kept packing, she flinched every time she added more. The whole endeavor had begun as an idea proposed by the Reverend William Copley Winslow of Boston to garner interest in the U.S. About Egypt. He also wanted to fundraise for the American branch of the Egypt Exploration Fund, of which he was the founder, the treasurer, and the secretary. Lecture tours like this had been common in the early 19th century and were even more so now in the later part of the century. With the secession of the Confederate States in 1860 and the American Civil War from 1860 to 1865, Olana travel to the U.S. from the UK and Europe had stopped. In the years after the Civil War, more and more wealthy Americans worked to bring British and European scholars to the United States. The purpose was threefold: to repair diplomatic relations with the UK, which had fallen apart when Britain had sided with the Confederacy, to rebuild educational institutions in the United States, and to create a truly American intelligentsia. Eminent scientists like Thomas Huxley, John Tyndall, and others toured the U.S. in these later years of the 19th century. So by the time Amelia arrived, she was one in a long line of scholars brought to the U.S. through the cooperation of institutions and private wealthy citizens. Sometime in the mid-1880s, Copley Winslow had extended the tour invitation to Amelia. She'd been wanting to go to the U.S. for a few years because she saw the potential in meeting with already established branches of the fund to cultivate new and existing subscribers. She feared her health wouldn't be good enough for her to go on her own, and she was worried about her partner Ellen Brasher's health. By 1888, she had paid trusted secretaries working with her at home and with Reginald Stuart Poole in London at the British Museum, and things were running more smoothly with the fund than they ever had before, so she could actually consider an invitation for a lecture tour. Kate Bradbury had become her assistant and secretary in early to mid-1888. Kate had come from a wealthy textile family in Manchester and was very well educated, and the two women worked well together. By early 1889, Amelia had accepted Copley Winslow's invitation. She actually looked forward to the long trip. Kate was happy to travel with Amelia and to care for her and be her assistant along the way. Kate assured that Amelia would always be organized, supportive, and never left. In turn, Amelia depended on Kate for almost everything on the trip, from laundry, correspondence, and meals to hair and makeup. These images were taken at the same photographer in 1890 in New York in March. I think this one, there's one of Amelia hanging here in the EES. Amelia was drawn to the prospect not only of spreading interest about ancient Egypt in the U.S. and getting subscribers for the American branch of the fund, but also by the income she could generate for herself. Amelia had written to Flinders Petrie in April 1888, quote, "The truth is that I want the money very much. The house wants repairing, much renewal of furniture, etc." Copley Winslow practically assured her of a small fortune, writing, quote, "You'll have larger fees than any of your predecessors ever had, except Dickens." The prospect of the honors and accolades U.S. institutions would bestow upon her didn't hurt either. So once universities, art institutions, museums, and other wealthy individuals found out she was coming, Amelia received over 300 requests for lectures in a 6-month period. They all took advantage of the fact that she would be on their side of the Atlantic, finally. All of those lecture requests were handled by the Redpath Lyceum Bureau, who managed her schedule, travel arrangements, guides, and chaperones, and paid Amelia $500 per week plus expenses to give the lectures that they and Copley Winslow had agreed to on her behalf. She also received equipment to show her lantern slides and a projectionist who traveled with the equipment to make sure that it operated as it should. So she had tech support. Amelia's engaging lectures drew record crowds and record fundraising, but the trip itself happened because of Kate Bradbury. It was Kate's presence and her duties on the trip in the U.S. that made Amelia's work possible. Indeed, Amelia did not keep much of a record of her whirlwind journey through America. She did keep a scrapbook of a number of newspaper clippings, and she wrote down in that same scrapbook every date and where they were, which is a super important record. But later, with Kate's help, Amelia did publish some of her lectures in a book called Pharaohs, Fellows, and Explorers in 1891 after she returned. Notably, Amelia did not thank Kate in the book's preface, contributing to Kate's erasure from this story of travel. Instead, we find Kate in her own words, starting on the 26th of October, 1889, at 7 p.m., just after dinner had been cleared on the HMS Etruria, until the 24th of March, 1890, when they only had 4 days left in America. Kate weaved a story of friendship and adventure in letters back to her family. These letters, now bound into a journal at the Griffith Institute in Oxford, are proof of her work and the impact that the trip made in Gilded Age America. There are a few events and people that historians credit with igniting public interest in Egypt and the U.S., but a full 5 years before James Breasted would return to the U.S. as the first American Egyptology PhD, and 2 years before the World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago would introduce Americans to the display of a street in Cairo, Amelia Edwards would enthrall American audiences from New York to Minneapolis about ancient Egypt. A few of the sources that I base a lot of this argument on. First, Roberto Munoz's article in the Bulletin for the History of Archaeology argues about the impact this trip had on archaeology in general, subtitled A Quiet Revolution in Archaeological Science. Munoz details the lecture tour and how Edwards became a powerful woman in a man's world. She argues that the tour shaped methodology in American Egyptology and archaeology. That is free online if you're interested. It's really good. Margaret C. Jones details this trip in a chapter of her recent biography, The Adventurous Life of Amelia B. Edwards. In her discussion, she highlights Amelia's punishing schedule and the people that she met, but she doesn't really talk about the impact that the women had on Egyptology in the U.S. or put her work in a wider context. But giving important context to lectures of this kind, Diarmaid A. Finnegan wrote a wonderful book about British scientists on the lecture circuit in Gilded Age America. The subtitle is The Voice of Science. In it, he uses the visits of several eminent men of science to address the reasons why these tours were so crucial to the building of American sciences. Tonight, I place Edwards' lecture tour in this long-established tradition of science lecture tours. I go further in depth than Munoz and tell a different story than Jones by also centering Kate Bradbury and her impact on the tour, thanks to her journals, and thanks to the Griffith Institute for letting me pull from these journals. And I shouldn't be looking at it. Sorry. There we go. That is one volume. That is just one volume, and it's 2 volumes. However, I'm still only going to tell you a tiny bit of the story because the impact that this short trip had of these 2 women from northern England to the northern United States is still being felt today. In the UK, and especially here at the EES, we're aware of Amelia Edwards and somewhat of Kate Bradbury's influence, but not so much in the US. Kate Bradbury and Amelia Edwards' journey to and through the United States fanned the flames of broad public interest in ancient Egypt in the US much earlier and much more broadly and deeply than most historians realize. Before Amelia and Kate dazzled American audiences, they had to get there first. About a week of being tossed about on the Atlantic, in the cold rain in New York Harbor, after about a week of being tossed around the Atlantic, the women arrived at the mouth of the Hudson River in New York on November 3rd, 1889. In the cold rain in New York Harbor, they first spotted the Statue of Liberty. Like so many others who came to the U.S., Kate was excited about finally seeing the statue. Lady Liberty was only 3 years old at the time and still showing her original copper color. Once off the boat and having gotten all their luggage and trunks, and most importantly, the lantern slides through customs, they were hounded by the press at the docks. While Kate got their ancient artifacts that were destined as presents for American museums, and which she was, quote, told to hush about, Amelia was interviewed by Mrs. Merrill of the New England Women's Press Club. All members of the press across the United States were excited to have Amelia and Kate visiting. And while women reporters tended to treat her kindly, other news outlets printed what they wanted of Amelia, commenting on her looks, her intentions, her nationalities, and more. They were worse than paparazzi and bothered the women a whole trip. Kate remarked after a few weeks and seeing several cuttings of Amelia, quote, "They make Miss E short and tall, stout and thin, plain and not plain. That she wears no jewelry surprises them." With their purse handler, America's American publisher, Richard Boker, they drove over the relatively new Brooklyn Bridge, originally called the East River Bridge. It was officially named the Brooklyn Bridge in 1915. As a historian, I can't stop it with these details. They're just fascinating to me, so forgive me. and they went over in a horse-drawn carriage. That afternoon, they arrived at the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn, one of the nicest hotels in the city at the time. They had apartments there with their own private entrance. And Kate remarked that the rooms were always too warm and the forced heat air in them too dry. But neither of them missed the radiant heat because they both loved not being cold all the time. And even if the rooms were not up to their expectations, rarely anything in the US met Kate's approval, both women loved the ice water and the views from the St. George Hotel. From her window looking to the southwest, Kate wrote that she could, quote, see the bay and Liberty's torch as the dark comes on. Had we been one story higher, the view would have been fine. Tonight, Sunday, there was a grand sunset over the river, and below the clear and brilliant scarlet orange and eau de Nil blue, deep chocolate crimson clouds passed. As the sunset faded and the moon rose, these turned copper color, absolutely metallic in luster, and covered all the sky that I could see. Kate was astounded by the clear, clean air in New York compared to the coal smoke of Manchester and London. The nights are so clear, she marveled to her father. Quote, the moonlight is like stage moonlight, especially as the buildings upon which it falls are of most varied architecture. Despite being enthralled with the colors of sunrise and sunset, Kate didn't like New York at all. She thought, quote, it was strange to walk along a street with a railway overhead in the middle and trams running under it. Telegraph, telephone, and electric light wires run overhead too. She noted also that, quote, the telephone wires are not insulated, so occasionally they rust and drop. To get around in Brooklyn, they had to walk, quote, along the narrow, unfrequented, horribly paved streets with trees either side, old world-looking streets, and a Dutch suggestion about them. Her opinions of New York may have been impacted by her exhaustion, except they remained critical throughout the entire tour. The rough crossing on the boat didn't allow much sleep that week, and both Kate and Amelia needed some time to rest and recover from the colds they had caught on the ship on the way over. So for the first few days in the U.S., they were both laid up, breathing the doctor's vapors and eating the most peculiar Concord grapes. By the time of Amelia's first lecture, though, the women were both ready to take America by storm. On November 7th, just 4 days after they arrived in the U.S., Amelia's first talk was at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Just a short walk from the hotel in the brisk winter air, the Academy was on Montague Street in the upscale neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights. The doctor's vapors had indeed worked wonders. Amelia's voice returned just in time for her to become one of the greatest science orators in U.S. history. There were around 2,400 seats to be had for her talk, The Buried Cities of Ancient Egypt, and it was probably sold out. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported the following day that even though Amelia was 58 years old, she, quote, does not look at all an old woman. Her black hair was streaked with gray and her voice was, quote, light but musical and clear. With all of these compliments, they went on to rave that she, quote, delighted and instructed an academy full of people last night for her first lecture in this country. Amelia told them about what the Egypt Exploration Fund was doing in Egypt and how the Boston Museum of Fine Arts had benefited from their work. Ever the fundraiser, she told them, quote, if you decide to be treated in a similar manner, it rests with yourself. The crowd understood her point, and the money began flowing in. For several weeks after they arrived, Kate and Amelia used New York as a base for travel around the area. They traveled to several women's colleges, Vassar, Smith, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Wellesley, and they were received by several of the administrators and presidents of these places. They went to Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, where the lecture was very well attended, and Kate raved about the grand elm trees. After New Haven, they went to Boston, a 6-hour train ride away, for a few weeks, where Kate wrote that Amelia, quote, carried them all captive as she was growing increasingly phenomenally popular. One Friday morning, following the talk in Boston, the New England Women's Press Association gave a reception for Amelia with over 400 women in attendance. They talked about how much had changed for women in the U.S. in the past 50 years, but also how much more needed to happen. Amelia supported more education for women and girls, the vote, and for more women to be in professions like journalism. In Boston, they also toured the Museum of Fine Art and met with dignitaries such as Oliver Wendell Holmes. In each town, they either stayed at a motel or in someone's home. Kate always liked the homes best because the food was better than that of the hotels, and they had a little bit of privacy. While in Boston, they stayed with Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett. These two women, both writers and deeply involved in Boston social circles, had lived together for decades and had a loving relationship, often called a Boston marriage. So Fields is over on the left and Jewett is on the right. Kate and Amelia grew very fond of both Annie and Sarah and hated to leave Boston. Kate said of them, quote, "Mrs. Fields and Miss Jewett are the only fine-mannered women we have seen, I think." During their time in New England, the women settled into a routine. If they were in a town or a city for more than a couple of days, which was rare, a typical schedule would involve a small breakfast in their rooms. Kate would write letters home to her family and to Amelia's secretary, Emily Patterson. Kate mentioned Miss P in several of her letters back home, which meant Emily was still working diligently while Amelia and Kate were on the lecture tour. Often, Kate would let Amelia sleep in and rest. Other times, Amelia needed to be up early to review or copy out her lectures. They would usually have guests to an afternoon meal or be guests for a larger lunch with several of the community leaders who had brought them to town. Often the meals were long and relatively fancy affairs with oysters, soups, bread and butter, cold meats and cheeses, coffee, tea, milk, and often wine. And I know all of these details because Kate wrote them all down. She was fascinated by the food. There was an obelisk-shaped ice cream at one meal, and she loved all the ice cream. She was like, "This ice cream is fantastic. I wish we had more ice cream in Britain." If there wasn't wine, Kate could quietly arrange for both of them to have teacups with a little claret in them. Kate was often unimpressed by the quality of the food, but she was stunned by the quantity of it. And again, she also enjoyed the ice cream, but it was winter, so frozen delicacies were easier to make and preserve in the late 1880s. Kate would also either do laundry or send it out. Most lectures would begin around 7 p.m. and would last for an hour or so they had to be at the lecture hall by 6:30 at the latest. So Kate had to begin doing Amelia's hair by 5:30 p.m., often while Amelia was still copying out her lectures or making notes or practicing her delivery. The women would get dressed, rush into a carriage, and get to the lecture hall on time, usually. Kate also made sure that everything was ready at each venue, that the projectionist had the slides ready, that Amelia's notes were available, and that everything started off without a hitch. Because she had so many other duties to attend to, Kate didn't stay for all of the lectures. Sometimes she would take a walk to town, or she would go back to their hotel to rest and write and ready them both for the reception and dinner that would come after. A few times, when Amelia was too ill to speak, Kate would give the lecture for her. Other evenings, she had to sit near the front and catch Amelia's attention with a white handkerchief 10 minutes before they had to leave to catch their train to the next stop. Afterwards, again, if they had time, they would meet at the reception, where they were both overwhelmed with flowers, cards, well wishes, and questions. It was a packed whirlwind schedule, but they mostly held up. In Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, as well as other towns, they were given tours in already established museums. After their time in Boston with Miss Jewett and Mrs. Fields, they went to Philadelphia in early December to stay with Miss Mary Coles, the daughter of a former governor of Illinois and a missionary and a philanthropist. She had traveled to Egypt herself twice and had acquired several artifacts of her own. Kate remarked that she had, quote, 1 or 2 good scarabs and a Menopot 3, the third cylinder, plenty of ordinary beads, and a good 26 Ushabti, apparently for a king Psammetichus. She had all her best things from Roche. This king was, in fact, Wahibra Psammetic, the first pharaoh of the 26th dynasty of the Saite period. This is probably not the Shabti, but it was one that I could put. Cole's travels would have been between 1884 and 1889, so she probably stopped by the Egyptian Museum in Cairo to buy a few things, as well as bought from dealers. Kate and Amelia were both duly impressed with her pieces. A few days after they arrived in Philadelphia, they were given a tour of the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. William Pepper, the provost at the time, took them on their tour. Herman Hilprecht, the Assyriologist at the university, spoke closely with Kate, while William Pepper, quote, laid hold on Miss Edwards, as Kate had remembered it. It had been an interesting tour, and both ladies delighted that Penn had a, quote, magnificent clay cylinder bearing a list of the buildings of Nebuchadnezzar, which the British Museum had counted themselves to buy. There were several hundred other items the Assyriologist had acquired for the museum, as he claimed, in order to prevent them from being stolen. William Pepper, the provost, had really wanted to talk to Amelia about getting Egyptian pieces for their museum. Kate wrote, quote, he is ambitious for the university and money seems to come to them whenever they ask for it. And this was actually true. Among many other accomplishments in the community from the start of his time as provost at UPenn, Pepper grew the university from 42 faculty members and 1,000 students to 245 faculty members and 2,600 students. He built 13 new buildings on campus and founded 12 new departments, including the University Museum and the Department of Archaeology and Paleontology. So he was very excited to see what else he could do, and working with the Egypt Exploration Fund was one of them. But he was interested in how to become a separate American branch of the Egypt Exploration Fund. The Philadelphia branch didn't want to have to answer to Kathleen Winslow, who had become overbearing in his leadership. Pepper claimed he could easily get about £1,000 subscribed annually, so Amelia was keen on working with him, as the university had just recently voted to open itself to women students. So this women's education was very important to Amelia Edwards. And in the EES archives, there is a lot about how problematic Kathleen Winslow was in the American branch. Over Christmas, they spent time at the home of Frederick Edwin Church, a friend Amelia had met while traveling in Italy. The home was called Olana and was located along the base of the Hudson River in the Catskill Mountains. Now a museum, it was then a large and stately family home. And Kate could not get enough of those views. She wrote home, quote, Church has bought the top of the hill here, reclaimed it for agriculture, made a park of it, and built a beautiful house on the top. When I drew up my blind an hour ago this morning, I was fairly breathless at the beauty of the view. What must it have been in the autumn? Just below is wooded, undulating land and a little lake, then the river, the Hudson, then the Catskill Mountains, real big hills, the first I've seen. The early morning light made it all into a picture, a dream, not a mere piece of earth. But after a restful week, they had to leave and make their way back to normal lectures, interviews, trains, and hotels in Boston and Princeton, with a few receptions thrown in, and all that plus terrible roads in New York City. Barely a week into the new year, on January 6th, Kate and Amelia were back in New York. This time, they stayed at the home of Eugene Augustus Hoffman, the dean of the General Theological Seminary. As with their other hosts throughout their tour, the Hoffmans were very well established and wealthy. They were benefactors of educational institutions like Harvard and Columbia University, as well as of the seminary. Hoffman was also the president of the New York Historical Society. His wife and one son lived at home in the lower west side of Manhattan. During their stay, Amelia and Kate had free use of Hoffman's carriage for a few days and chose to venture up to the Central Park Museum, also known as the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1890, it stood in its current place on 5th Avenue and 82nd Street. And as they drove through the Central Park in a carriage in a drizzle, they marveled at the quiet that enveloped them. They felt so far from the city noises they had become accustomed to. There were no bigger transverse roads from the west side to the east side of the park yet, so they had to ride along the smaller pedestrian paths. Less than 2 decades old, the park was an urban marvel. Kate thought the park was, quote, very beautiful and all made ground of carted soil, except that some of the great bare rocks are left standing. They were glad of the carriage in the rain and arrived at the museum within 30 minutes. It had started as a Gothic Revival style building, and already by 1890, it had to be expanded. It was 4 stories high, built of red and gray stone, and had an imposing front entrance off 5th Avenue with a wide and welcoming cart path. So this is likely the same path they would have pulled up to the front. When they arrived at the museum, they copied some Egyptian inscriptions, or what there was available. The Egyptian collection at the Met in 1890 was housed in the entryway, and was not very extensive. It competed for space and attention with the classical statuary the museum held, along with visitors weaving their way through all of the pieces, trying to figure out where to go next. Kate wrote home about their time with the small collection that it was, quote, not brilliant, but has several good fragments of stela from the Memphite period. Then they met with William Henry Goodyear, who was in the middle of his dispute with Luigi Palmer de Cesnola about the authenticity of some vases. This story would end with Goodyear being locked out of his office and out of the grounds of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But it is dramatic. But for now, Goodyear asked Amelia Edwards to look at the Cypriot vases with him to ask her opinion on their origin. He believed their decoration was Greek, but of Egyptian origin, and Kate and Amelia both agreed. So they took his side in this argument, and that got here. After another successful lecture that night, the next day, on January 7th, they started their day packing for Albany and clearing up some correspondence. Then they went to tour the Abbott collection in the New York Historical Society. Collected by British physician Henry Abbott during his 20 years of living in Egypt, the collection held over 1,000 pieces of Egyptian material. They had been displayed from 1853 to 1860 in the Stuyvesant Institute on Broadway in Lower Manhattan. And after Abbott died in 1859, the collection was sold to the New York Historical Society, which Kate called, quote, the only serious museum in the city at the time. In a detailed letter to her family, she wrote, seeing the artifacts, we could only wish that we would have come before instead of to the Central Park collection. There are 3 mummied Apis bowls and a skull from Dashur. The catalog says it must mean Saqqara. Old Empire tablets galore. The seal ring of Khufu, a pair of earrings bearing the cartouche of Mina, papyri, etc., etc. Handing me a big scarab in Tel El Amarna blue with inlaid white hieroglyphics, one of Queen T's, the curator said, here's an elegant bug. You know that bug is American for beetle. I could not help but laughing and said, surely this is too good to be called a bug. A few minutes afterwards, he handed me a beautiful natural scarab and said, well, that's a bug anyway. The whole collection is huddled away, much of it's quite out of reach of daylight, and very ill cataloged. I love her comments on everything. Abbott himself had written the first catalog in 1854, but it was sloppy and needed to be redone. Kate noted several of her favorite items, which included jewelry, wooden pieces, and gold, and lamented in her diary that, quote, the Historical Society must build a museum. More than 3 decades after Kate rightly criticized the catalog, Caroline Ransom completed a partial catalog in 1924. They never did build a large museum, but in 1937, the New York Historical Society permanently loaned the Abbott collection to the Brooklyn Museum, where it is now. And I'm going to pull that Brooklyn Museum in at the end because it's sort of this full circle moment, which is fantastic. Never spending much time in one place, the women moved on quickly to several other locations. Albany, where Amelia gave her lecture at a church, on to Rochester, where the talk was held at the university, Elmira, Utica, those are all in New York, and then they moved further west. They went through Ohio, including Toledo, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. The furthest west they went was Minneapolis, where they were taken to meet with a group of Sioux who were living in a small group of teepees. Kate's accounting of their interaction is about what you would expect of the period, curious, condescending, and colored by the stories Mark Twain had told her about them when they were in Massachusetts. It's not good, which is why I'm not repeating it. If your head is spinning from trying to keep track of all the places Kate and Amelia went, and all the people they met, and all of the things they did, then you are following right along as you should be. Their whirlwind tour would make anyone exhausted. Margaret Jones states that it isn't clear if the busy schedule was due to Kathleen Winslow building in extra talks or stops, or if it was Amelia's desire to fit in all that they could while they were there. But soon, they were off again, heading back east to Chicago. It's like take this part. Kate actually kept a really good map of when they were in the northeast of the United States, but sort of quit trying to keep a map when they moved west, which is fair. So I think that would be interesting to know. Often, we talk about interest in America in Egyptology exploding in the prairie town of Chicago with a display of Cairo on the Midway Plaisance at the World Columbian Exhibition in 1892. Some argue that American Egyptology officially arrived when the University of Chicago was founded in 1895. Funded by John D. Rockefeller, it had a museum populated by the Egyptian artifacts purchased by America's first Egyptology PhD, James Henry Breasted. Breasted was also the first professor, hired as an associate with tenure, of Egyptology in the United States, taking on the job in 1895. I would argue, however, that it wasn't the wealthy men who started building Egyptology in Chicago, although many of them and their wives certainly funded it. Instead, it was the work of Amelia Edwards and Kate Bradbury in 1890. In fact, the Chicago they arrived at by train. The Chicago they had arrived in by train on February 16, 1890, was still recovering from the Great Fire of 1871. They arrived to a flurry of new buildings, innovative educational efforts, and brand new municipal works, much of which was funded not by the city, the state, or even the federal government, but instead by wealthy donors and the needs of the market. For example, the rail lines that had originally connected Chicago to Galena, Illinois, and then on to the rest of the country had been destroyed during the Great Fire. They were rebuilt over several years from investments in new commercial efforts in meat packing, mostly pork, with the stockyards and slaughterhouses quickly making Chicago a Central American metropolis. And it smelled really bad. In this new bustling city, the women stayed with the wealthy and influential family of Wirt Dexter, a prominent Chicago attorney who had helped in recovery efforts after the fire, and whose family had a history of being benefactors of educational institutions like Harvard. Now, in the Prairie District of downtown Chicago, in 1890, the large New England-style farm home would have been mostly out of city limits, so it's sort of been subsumed as the city has grown. Set back about 200 yards from the lakeshore, they would have had sweeping views of Lake Michigan and the sunrise every day. Kate thought that the house at 1721 South Prairie Avenue was, quote, very comfortable, and the interior was very picturesque. It was a massive mansion. Amelia and Kate were celebrated at several receptions, both at the Dexter House, as well as at the Art Institute of Chicago, about a half-mile away. The first building, constructed in 1879 as part of the reinvigoration of the burnt city, the Art Institute will find its permanent home in 1893 as part of the World's Columbian Exhibition. Even in 1890, the Art Institute already had a few Egyptian pieces, but there was clearly an appetite for more. Community leaders like the Wirt Dexters, the Marshall Fields, and others began to push for a university in town to bring more people and prestige to Chicago. By 1895, John D. Rockefeller funded it, made a Semitic language scholar from Yale its president, who then hired James Henry Breasted as its first Egyptologist. The women were also lunched by other prominent ladies in Chicago, such as Mrs. Marshall Fields, whose husband's store had been rebuilt at Franklin Street a decade earlier. In 1897, his store was rebuilt at State and Washington Streets and is now the large Macy's that's there. They had met so many wonderful women, Kate could hardly list them all and her favorite things about them. She was, quote, greatly struck with the beauty of many of the women and their almost too pretty dress. Kate thought Chicago was a great city and so well paved. Clearly not like New York. Amelia's talks and receptions were so well attended in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs that it wasn't just standing room only. They were squeezing in outside to peer through the windows. In one event, Kate wrote that only 300 of the 1,800 people who wished to attend could fit. Quote, it was a fearful crush, and the people in the street whose heads were level with the tops of the windows shared in the proceedings. Without access yet to other primary sources about their time in Chicago, it's hard for me to say the immediate impact of Amelia's talks and their meetings and their receptions. We know the talks raised a lot of money, and the Egypt Exploration Fund had a branch in the city for a little while. In 1893, the city hosted the World's Columbian Exhibition, the World's Fair, along with the famous Midway Plaisance and the infamous Cairo Street. Amelia was also placed on the honor roll at the Women's Building in this fair in 1893, along with Queen Victoria and Florence Nightingale, among others. Some of the fund money went to James Breasted in 1894 and 1895, which he used on his trip to Egypt to buy pieces for museums around Chicago. So the Art Institute had requests, the university had some requests, some rich people had some requests. He bought a bunch of stuff. While women were still at work in the U.S., William Copley Winslow outlined some of the impact of their visits in a letter to Kate in February of 1890. He mentioned several of the donors he had gotten for the American branch of the fund in Boston, and based on Amelia's work, he said, quote, "I am putting out my best efforts for funds. I have just bagged Mr. Harris of North London as a perpetual patron." He concluded by adding an exclamation, quote, "Amelia Blandford Edwards was the first woman to have LL.D. from a recognizably well-known plus first-class college." That was Smith University. So he was just so excited that these things were happening. And he took more credit than he may have been doing. They made their way back to the East Coast through Michigan, Ohio, where Amelia fell and broke her arm, and New York. As the tour wound down, the pair became tired of hotels and rooms, packing and unpacking, riding in carriages and trains. They had seen and done so much, both enjoyable and excruciating. At the start of the tour, Amelia was criticized for being a bit wooden and stiff, but by the end, she'd gotten very comfortable with the large audiences. The last lecture of Amelia's tour took place at the very same venue as her first, the Brooklyn Academy, on March 10th, 1890. That talk was attended by some of the wealthiest people in Brooklyn and Manhattan. For others who could get tickets, the Academy was standing room only. As you can see here, it says that she will lecture on the literature and religion of ancient Egypt. There was going to be musical recitations. I don't know about those. I wish I did. This is her farewell lecture to Brooklyn, the city in which she gave her first American lecture, and the net proceeds of the lecture to be used in the purchase of works of Egyptian art for museums of the Brooklyn Institute. And we're definitely going to come back to that. To celebrate the end of the tour, New York's Cirrhosis Club, the first professional women's club in the U.S., honored Amelia with a lavish luncheon, and I'm sorry about the fuzziness of this. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle on March 19th reported about this luncheon, celebrating the Cirrhosis' 22nd anniversary, and they made Amelia an honorary member of the club, and in response, she, quote, delivered one of the most felicitous addresses of personal thanks and congratulation that have been encountered in recent times. And this was on that same day, a different paper in Brooklyn. The banquet scene at the anniversary celebration of Cirrhosis made a pretty picture, especially during the address of Miss Amelia B. Edwards. There's often something exaggerated in the admiration of women for a woman who has gained fame. But after all, it disposes effectively of a popular fallacy. There's really nothing on earth more spontaneous and more genuine than women's enthusiasm over women. Yeah. Kate recalled all of this a little bit differently, and here I will quote at length. There's going to be a lot of words on this next slide, but just so I'm not reading to you and you can follow along and we don't hopefully get lost. Thank you so much. So yesterday, we had a long and fatiguing day. The Cirrhosis, the Great New York Women's Club, made Miss E their principal guest at their annual luncheon at Delmonico's. Very loath and tired beforehand, we went there, as we hoped, late enough to avoid the reception part of the proceedings, and only in time for the lunch. But a little receiving Miss E had to do of ladies presented to her by the president, Mrs. Dick Clymer. Mrs. Clymer is a sweet woman with a quiet and lovely face. Among many people presented to us were a fair number of whom we had met before, here and elsewhere. Indeed, the dresses were generally marvelous, and the jewels galore. Of course, all daylight was excluded, and many were in evening dress. There were no men. 300 women in all sat down, 50 at a table at 6 tables. The club numbers 160 members, so they let non-club members in. The luncheon was good, but wineless. Only I had asked Mrs. Clymer beforehand to secure some wine for Miss E, and not to shock and hurt some strongly teetotal members of the club, claret, sent by the doctor husband of one member, was put before Miss E in a plated jug and drunk by her out of a coffee cup to match the rest of us. She acts like she was not also drinking this wine to match the rest of us. We had each a small birch bark canoe full of lovely flowers set before us, and each canoe carried a silk flag of the Stars and Stripes. The room was draped with English and American flags. To Miss E, Mrs. Holm presented, along with an original poem, a large canoe filled with roses and lilies of the valley. At either end floated a flag, one the Union Jack and one the Stars and Stripes. 2 paddles were tied upright in the center with a white satin ribbon on which was the date and Miss E's name in bold letters. It was very pretty. Miss E sat at Mrs. Kleiner's right hand, I at Miss E's right, and at my right, Miss Sally Joy White from Boston of the New England Presswomen. She talked of the American system of education and of American government, besides of many other things. Opposite me, a little elderly Mrs. Lucy Stone, also from Massachusetts in Boston, who took the anti-slavery platform in slavery days and was announced sarcastically from the pulpit as, quote, hen who would crow like a cock. She asked for cream out of Miss E's milk jug and was shocked to find the nature of the milk. I am certain she was. In the end, Kate recalled they had a fine time and had, quote, forgotten that we were tired. Almost. These 2 talks at the Brooklyn Academy and the groups Kate and Amelia were celebrated by were perfect bookends to their U.S. tour. The main point of having this final talk here in Brooklyn was to raise money and to purchase art and artifacts for what would become the Brooklyn Museum. Just 12 miles away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Central Park, Brooklyn wanted to be just as big and just as important as the Central Park Museum. In the end, they didn't quite get as big as the Metropolitan Museum, but their fundraising for a new building was successful. This museum was built in 1895, in part due to the money that poured in after Kate and Amelia's visit. By 1916, the museum had accepted a major donation of Egyptian artifacts from the family of Charles Wilbur, who was a Gilded Age robber baron. He'd been involved in the Tammany Hall scandal, made a ton of money, and escaped so that he was not prosecuted. In 1937, the Brooklyn Museum received the Abbott Collection from the New York Historical Society, thereby solidifying their place in world-renowned Egyptology collections and bringing the effects of what Amelia and Kate continued to accomplish full circle, 40 years, 50 years later. New York, Boston, Chicago, and sites in between, in a Gilded Age tradition of British scientists on the American lecture circuit, no one had done it the way Amelia and Kate had done it. Before them, the lecturers had been men like Charles Dickens, John Tyndall, Thomas Huxley, Alfred Russel Wallace, whose goal it was to educate the public in their fields of literature, physics, and biology. For Amelia and Kate, the main purpose of their tour was to fan decades-old sparks of interest in ancient Egypt and the U.S. into flames. They did so well that their audiences were bigger than those of any previous visitors, except Dickens. And they left a trail of financial and civic support for Egyptology everywhere they had visited. Amelia and Kate were welcomed by the public with open arms from New York to Chicago, from St. Paul to Cleveland. Some establishment figures in the history of Egyptology criticized the tour as not being a serious endeavor because it was done by a woman, and an untrained one at that. Even though Amelia hadn't had university or field training in Egyptology, very few of her critics had either. Today, we might call Amelia a crossover phenomenon. She excited interest from both scholars and the public. She was responsible for raising money across the northern United States in support of academic and public interactions with Egyptology on a scale not seen before her. Copley Winslow had been right about her. He had known that Amelia, quote, could strike the right balance between sparkle and scholarship. Their impact in some places was felt immediately through ticket sales and building fundraisers. In other places, the financial support garnered for the fund in the U.S. and for its several branches were growing. They were poised to have a long-lasting partnership with the UK. This did happen, but if we only look at letters in the Egypt Exploration Fund's archives, we see several that deal with the American issues. So their connection was fraught. Not to mention the fact that William Copley Winslow was asked to resign from the American branch of the fund and did so. Not long after that, he published a tell-all, The Truth About the Egypt Exploration Fund, and he dedicated it to Amelia Edwards, who was certain would have supported him. As a closing for this talk, a talk that arguably Amelia and Kate ultimately led you to, I couldn't think of anything better than this excerpt from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle a week before they went back home. Thank you so much.
The Eagle is of the opinion that Miss Edwards' visit will do a great deal of good in teaching the men of America how learned and how winning a woman of study can be, and in teaching the women of America what an authority in art, archaeology, and history one of their sex can become. The lady has opened up to the reading public of the United States a delightful department of knowledge. She has brought to the subject she has developed a thoroughness of learning and a mingled strength and grace of statement which cannot be too much admired or commended. Her personal influence has been as fine and as fragrant as her intellectual power has been strong and inciting.
Well, thank you. God. One more button. Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
And thank you everyone for bearing with us with slight technical difficulty. But brilliant. Well, thank you. Yeah, definitely. This is not all around.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, hopefully everyone was able to follow along. And yeah, I have to admit, we of course have a very special place in all of our hearts here at the ES for Amelia Edwards and the founder. But it was so interesting to get so much more about Bradbury.
Yeah.
Normally isn't so sensitive.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially with comments on food and things. It's very interesting to know at the ES we've started making ice cream. You know,
Really?
yeah. So maybe it's in the ES sense. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I can tell you wherever she is, she's very happy.
There we go. And we would please her now. But yes, I will dampen your expectations for the reception. We do have wine, but not lists of ice cream or other marvelous things. Okay, well, all that remains for me to say is a huge thank you.
Oh, thank you
for coming, and I think we can do an applause. I'm sure there's a virtual applause going on there. Yeah, that's what I love.
Well, thank you everybody for coming on live. And you, if you have any more questions, you can. That's Instagram, so you can send me a message.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could go to the final screen. Here is the course. So yes, please do check that out if you want to learn a little bit more. Of course, it's on our website, or please do scan the QR code. So we'll leave that up for a little while. But yeah, thank you so much, Sheppard, for such an interesting insight into those US lecture talks. I think here in the office we didn't know too much about the American forays and their lectures, and over 100 of them. So yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah,
find out more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you everyone in person for joining us, and thank you online for joining us. If you would like to see more, please do visit our website for more events and things coming up. So yeah. Thank you very much. Of course, I'm inviting those in the room. We do have a small wine reception downstairs. Apologies for those of you online who are not joined, but I do hope you go and get a refresher of your choice to enjoy afterwards.
So maybe Clary and the cup.
Yeah, maybe. So yes, thank you all so much, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.